hadn't even opened the folder. Lorraine slid across her desk before she looked up from her computer screen and said, "Natalie, I need to stop you right there. According to the state filing system, you transferred majority ownership of Web Design Group to your husband approximately 5 months ago." I remember the exact sound of the Chicago wind against the window of her Michigan Avenue office. It was February. The kind of cold that doesn't announce itself. It just presses through the glass like it belongs there. I sat still for a count of 5. Then I said, "Say that again." She did. "My name is Natalie Sutton Webb. I'm 36 years old and I've been a licensed architect since I was 27. My father, Lawrence Sutton, spent 32 years building a small but respected design firm on the north side of Chicago. He called it Sutton Design. He used to say the name was intentional. He wanted clients to know they were buying a person, not a logo. When I was growing up, my dad would bring me to job sites on Saturdays. I'd wear a hard hat 3 sizes too big, and he'd walk me through the bones of buildings while they were still being assembled before the walls went up and hid everything that mattered. "Natalie," he'd say, "if the foundation isn't right, nothing else is either. Doesn't matter how beautiful the finished thing looks." I used to think he was just talking about buildings. I met Curtis Webb at a structural engineering conference in Milwaukee when I was 29. He was sharp, funny in a quiet way, and he talked about load-bearing structures the same way I talked about natural light, like it was something he genuinely loved. We got married 18 months later in a small ceremony at a vineyard outside Galena. My father gave a toast that made half the room cry. He said, "Curtis, I'm not giving you my daughter. I'm trusting you with her." Curtis laughed and said, "I'll treat that trust like a cornerstone." We rebranded the firm after we merged our work, my creativity and client relationships, Curtis's engineering oversight. We renamed it Web Design Group. My father officially retired but stayed on as a consultant. He came by the office every Tuesday morning, drank bad coffee from the break room, and reminded us that the best buildings were the ones people never thought about because they just worked. For a while, everything did just work. We grew the firm from 9 people to 22. We picked up contracts with commercial real estate developers, a few boutique hotel groups, and eventually landed the Harrington account, a family-run development company building a $3.2 million convention center on the west side. That contract alone would have funded 2 years of growth. Curtis handled the engineering coordination. I handled the Harrington family directly. But a firm that looks healthy in the portfolio isn't always healthy underneath. Somewhere around year 4 of our marriage, the texture of things changed. Curtis started staying later at the office. When I asked about his day, he'd give me the kind of answer that technically contains words but says nothing at all. We stopped cooking dinner together on Sundays. We stopped doing most things together. Actually, I told myself it was the Harrington pressure, the growth pains of running a firm, the particular exhaustion that comes from being business partners and spouses at the same time. Then Briella Hayes joined us. Hired her. That's the part one have to say plainly because it matters. She was 26, fresh out of graduate school at the Illinois Institute of Technology with a portfolio that was genuinely impressive and a kind of quiet determination in her eyes that I recognized in myself at that age. She didn't oversell herself in the interview. She just showed me her work and said, "I want to be somewhere I can actually learn something." I thought that was a good answer. I brought her on as a junior designer. For the first year, Briella was exactly what her resume said. She was hardworking, eager to absorb everything. Respectful. She'd knock on my office door before leaving every evening. "Anything else you need, Natalie?" I'd wave her off. "Go home, Briella. You're going to burn out by 30 if you don't pace yourself." Curtis started mentoring her on the engineering side. They had lunch together a few times to talk through technical specifications on a project she'd been assigned to. I noticed, but I didn't think anything of it. He mentored junior staff. That was part of his job. My father got his diagnosis in April. Stage 3 lung cancer. He had never smoked a cigarette in his life, which felt like a particular cruelty. I drove to his house in Evanston every weekend after that. We'd sit on his porch, even when it was cold, because he liked the air. He'd tell me things he'd been holding on to for years about the firm, about money, about people. Most people are good, he told me once. But the ones who aren't are very good at knowing which doors to leave unlocked. I didn't fully understand what he meant. He died in October, a Tuesday morning. The trees along Sheridan Road had just gone orange and red. It was one of those Chicago falls that makes you forget how brutal the winters are. And I remember thinking it was a good day for the world to feel beautiful because I needed it to be. Curtis stood next to me at the funeral. He held my hand and said, "I've got you." I believed him. When you're grieving and the person beside you says that, you wrap yourself around the words without examining them. You need them to be true. 3 months later, Lorraine Marsh, who had been my father's attorney for nearly a decade, called to schedule an appointment. She needed to walk me through Lawrence's estate documents. He had left me his stake in the original Sutton Design intellectual property, a commercial rental property in Logan Square, and a brokerage account. All told, just under $8.5 million. I drove to her office on a Thursday afternoon, parked in the garage off Wacker, took the elevator up. Lorraine was already at her desk, reading glasses on, a yellow legal pad beside her laptop. She'd known my father since before I started kindergarten. She shook my hand and said, "He was a good man, Natalie." "He was," I said. We started going through the paperwork and then Lorraine paused, looked at her screen, looked at me, and said the thing that 5 seconds of silence couldn't fully absorb. She was looking at the Illinois Secretary of State Business Records database, Web Design Group, and where my name had appeared as a 51% majority owner, a split we'd maintained since the merger, it now read differently. Curtis Webb 70%. Natalie Webb 30%. I said very slowly, "That's not right." Lorraine typed something else, pulled up the actual filing, turned her screen toward me. There was a signature on the restructuring amendment. Soft first stroke, the capital N with a slight backward lean. My signature, the one I'd been using since high school. My hands went cold. I thought about every stack of papers Curtis had ever handed me with a pen already uncapped. About how many times I had signed things while on the phone with a client or while answering an email or while my father was in the hospital and my brain was running on 4 hours of sleep and the particular exhaustion of watching someone you love disappear slowly. Lorraine told me to breathe. She said she would pull the full filing history. She told me not to contact Curtis. She told me to go home and act normal. Said it the way doctors say it clinically, like she'd given that instruction before. "Whatever you're feeling right now, Natalie, keep it inside until we know what we're dealing with. The moment he knows you know, the game changes." He nodded. I drove home in the wrong lane of Lakeshore Drive for almost half a mile before I noticed. That night, Curtis had made pasta, which was a thing he used to do when we were first married and which he hadn't done in years. He had music on in the kitchen. He looked relaxed in a way that made my stomach tilt. I set my bag down and said I was tired from the meeting. He said, "Of course it's a hard time." He put a bowl in front of me and I ate it with a fork and said nothing. The next morning I called Daphne Torres, our CFO. She'd been with the firm for 6 years, longer than most of our staff. She was methodical, the way only accountants who genuinely care can be. She triple-checked things, not because someone asked her to, but because the idea of an error living in her spreadsheets offended her personally. I told her I needed to review the vendor payment history for the past 2 years, specifically anything related to outside consulting contracts. I told her to keep it between us. She called me back by 4 o'clock. "Natalie," she said, and her voice was flat in a way that meant she was controlling it carefully. "We have a line item called BH Creative Consulting. It appears in the book starting about 18 months ago. 17 payments over that period, total just over $160,000. Already new. Briella Hayes. Her middle initial registered as an LLC in Cook County, Oz. The invoices say design consultation and rendering services, but there are no corresponding project files in our system. No timestamps, no client ties, no version history, nothing." Closed my eyes. The money didn't come from Curtis's personal account. Came from the firm, from the account that held client retainers, From money people paid us because they trusted us. I told Daphne to back everything up and not to breathe a word of it. She said, "I've already started." I spent that week doing what Lorraine told me to do. Nothing visible. I sat in client meetings. I answered emails. I approved project timelines. I had a 40-minute phone call with George Harrington about the convention center's revised footprint. And I was completely calm throughout because some knowledge turns you into a different person the moment you receive it. And that person is colder and quieter and considerably more precise than the one you used to be. Then I drove to Briella's apartment building one evening after a former colleague mentioned offhandedly that they'd seen Curtis's car in that neighborhood more than once. I sat across the street for 40 minutes. They came out together. Curtis had his hand on the small of her back. She was laughing at something he'd said. She looked up at him with an expression I recognized. Not from my own face, but from photographs of mine I couldn't look at anymore. I didn't honk. I didn't roll down the window. I drove home and added the photographs to the folder on my laptop. The confrontation happened 4 days later. Curtis came home late and I was sitting at the kitchen table with the folder open. I said, "Tell me about BH Creative Consulting." The space between his eyes tightened. And then I said, "Tell me about the ownership amendment filed in September." He went very still. And then, like a man who has been holding something heavy for too long, he just set it down. He sat across from me and said, "You were going to find out eventually. I thought after the Harrington deal closed, we'd be in a better position to talk about it fairly." Fairly, I repeated. The firm needs new leadership structure. You're a visionary, Natalie. I've always said that. But the business decisions, the structural weight, I've been carrying that. The restructuring reflects the actual division of labor. The restructuring you slipped into the documents I signed while my father was dying. He flinched. One small quick flinch, then it was gone. "And Briella," I said. He looked at the table. "I love her." I'm not sure what I expected him to say, but hearing that word was its own kind of cold. Not because it hurt the way it would have 2 years ago, but because I realized sitting there that I had been watching the end of this marriage for a long time. I had just kept reclassifying the evidence. He told me then that he had the Harrington relationship, that he'd been the primary contact with George's project manager for several months. He told me that if I fought the ownership change, he could make the Harrington situation complicated. He didn't use the word blackmail. He didn't need to. "I'm asking you," he said, "to be practical." I looked at him, the man who quoted my father's toast at our wedding. I said, "I need a few days to think." He thought that meant he had won. What it meant was that I was already thinking. Lorraine filed an emergency petition with the circuit court the following morning to contest the ownership amendment on grounds of fraudulent misrepresentation. Daphne provided a sworn affidavit about the BH Creative Consulting payments. I handed Lorraine the audio recording I'd made of Curtis's conversation at the kitchen table. The one about Harrington, about leverage, about being practical. She listened to it once and said he just described extortion. I called George Harrington myself, drove to his office in Oak Park, brought the full project file, and spent 2 hours walking him through every design decision my team had made over the past 14 months. George was 61 years old, had built his company the same patient, brick by brick way my father had built his. And when I was finished, he looked at me and said, "Natalie, my father shook hands with Lawrence Sutton in 1987 on the first deal they ever did together. This firm's relationship is with you." I drove back to the city, feeling something I hadn't felt in weeks. Not relief exactly, more like solid ground under my feet again. Briella had been coming by the house with increasing frequency, picking up Curtis's things, lingering, making small suggestions about their space that were really small claims on it. One afternoon I came home and found her in my kitchen using my French press. She gave me a look that was almost apologetic and said Curtis thought it would be easier if I just... And I said, "No. I think it's actually easier if you go." She went. But 3 days later Curtis announced she needed somewhere to stay. Some issue with her building. He says it was just for a week. He used exactly that tone. The one that makes a reasonable request sound unreasonable to refuse. Said fine. I let them think I was wearing down. What I was actually doing was letting Lorraine's investigator finish the financial trace she'd commissioned on Briella's LLC. It came back with something I hadn't anticipated. BH Creative Consulting had a silent affiliate arrangement with a firm called Orion Design Partners, a mid-size architecture group based in Indianapolis that had been quietly trying to absorb Chicago studios for 3 years. Briella had been placed at Web Design Group intentionally. The payments weren't Curtis funding a girlfriend's side business. They were Orion funding a mole. Lorraine confirmed it through LLC filing records and 2 emails Daphna had legally recovered from Briella's company correspondence, which had been routed through our firm's cloud server. Curtis didn't know. That was the strangest part. He thought he was in a love affair. He had handed over majority control of our firm to a woman who was being paid by a competitor to dismantle it from the inside. He thought he was the one making moves. He had been a piece on someone else's board the entire time. The Harrington presentation was scheduled for a Tuesday in late March. Full design team, several investors, George's family in attendance. Curtis had told Harrington's project manager he'd be presenting the structural revisions. He scheduled it without telling me. I walked in with Daphna and Lorraine's associate attorney. Curtis's face went through 3 expressions when he saw me. Surprise, calculation, recovery. He smiled. Natalie, glad you could make it. Of course, I said. It's our project. I presented first, walked through the full design evolution, the client feedback integration, the revised timeline. George Harrington sat in the front row with his daughter and nodded throughout. When Curtis tried to interrupt a smooth segue about structural revisions that had impacted the project direction, I let him speak for 40 seconds and then I said, Actually, George, there's something I want to share with the room in the interest of full transparency. Lorraine's associate had already coordinated with the court. The ownership amendment was under formal contest. The Orion Design affiliation with BH Creative Consulting was in the packet I distributed. Daphna walked through the financial irregularities in 4 minutes, the way accountants do when they've spent weeks preparing. Clearly, without drama, without raising her voice once. George Harrington set his copy of the documents on the table and looked at Curtis for a long time. Curtis said, "This is being taken out of context." George said quietly, "I think you should leave my office." In the parking lot, Curtis grabbed my arm. He was breathing hard. He said things I won't repeat here. 2 of George's associates were nearby and they saw it happen. I documented it the way Lorraine had told me to document everything. The courts moved slowly, as courts do, but they moved. The ownership amendment was invalidated 6 months later on grounds of fraudulent misrepresentation. The financial fraud case, embezzlement of firm funds, and conspiracy related to the Orion placement took longer. Briella took a plea. Curtis did not, and it cost him considerably more. The Harrington Convention Center broke ground the following November. I stood at the site in a hard hat, the Chicago wind doing exactly what Chicago wind does, and I thought about my father walking me through job sites when I was small enough that his hard hats fell over my eyes. He used to say, "If the foundation isn't right, nothing else is either." It took losing almost everything to understand. He hadn't been talking about buildings at all. He'd been talking about this, about knowing who you're building with, about reading what people do instead of what they say, about making sure the people who hold the keys to your work are people who actually deserve them. I changed the firm name back to Sutton Design. Felt right. And when people ask me now how I kept going in those months when Curtis had the paperwork and the leverage and someone else's coffee in my kitchen, I tell them the same thing my father told me at every site walk right before we stepped into the bones of something new. You look at what's still standing. You start there.